Hello everybody, this is True Demon. I'm going to show a little bit of data and try to explain a little bit about what I think is going on with the short interest falling on Progenity. The reason I'm addressing this now is because everybody's been pretty obsessed with a short squeeze. And while I can appreciate that and I do really enjoy short squeezes, um, it's not the end-all be-all of what is moving this stock as much as it has been moving. So first of all, let's go over the short interest data. We can look at the exchange reported short interest versus the estimated short interest on Ortex, which if we look at what the exchange report, it started having some serious incongruency starting on the 30th of September. And whatever was being reported was vastly below what Ortex was estimating according to what was available to be shorted and what was lent out for shorting by the brokers. A lot of researchers and technical analysts on YouTube have already said this a dozen times over, but Ortex isn't a perfect platform. It has access to 80% of prime broker data, which is a lot, and it's faster and more data than we have ever had access to in the past, but it's still not perfect. So specifically, let's look at what the price was trading at when this short interest took off. We were back down here between $1.20 and $1.60 from low to high. After that, the short interest took off in a matter of 4 days and went straight through the roof, and it never came down. Shortly after that, the price rose, and all throughout the increasing short interest, the price had already gone past a 100% gain from when the shorts had entered. So anything below $3.50 is basically a massive loss for shorts, and that's when they started deciding that, at least some of them decided that was when it was time to start getting out. And as they did, the price continued to rise. And now suddenly we have had just a ton of shares that have disappeared off the face of the earth from the short interest reports, and the price didn't move in a way that agreed with that movement. So let's just look at this objectively. So as the price is rising, we can see that shorts were expecting it to fall down, and it didn't, and the price continued rising against them. Clearly, some that had gotten in recently decided that it was time to go when the price peaked up over $4, and it looked like there had been a few of them that got squeezed out. But there is a lot of missing explanation for why this short interest just suddenly just disappears and the price doesn't move to match that kind of drop in short interest, because as we all know, when shorts cover, they have to buy the stock in order to cover their positions, right? This is true, but we have to take into account some of the uniqueness that Progenity has in the way that it's being traded and the way it's being shorted. So, what do we know about Progenity? We know that its majority shareholder is Athyrium Capital Management, which is a massive hedge fund. Well, not massive. That's probably a bit too far. They're a significant hedge fund. They manage a few $100 million, which is more than enough capital to move a company like this and push it around. And they can also afford to trade with algorithms, and they can also afford to trade privately in dark pools and come to agreements with other entities. And also, Ethereum has several smaller funds that it manages as independent corporations. They're all tied to the greater mothership of Ethereum, but they are technically separate companies. So, one of the things that I use as my evidence for my suspicions that Ethereum is playing both sides of this stock and shorting Progenity, as well as accumulating more shares, is that at this time, October the 1st, um, is when the stock was doing supremely well. And just 5 minutes before the announcement of a dilution came, a 8 million share order went through to the sell side, and it crashed the price from $2.20 straight down to $1.60. And then the announcement came 5 minutes after that took place, and it was made public that the price continued to fall. And it was shortly after that that it hit its recent low of $1.28. It did rebound, but what was interesting was the timing of everything. At that time, there was only one company that had more than 8 million shares to sell. And even if you had considered that somebody with knowledge of what was going on was trying to short the company, they would have had to borrow shares. They would have had to borrow 8 million shares. That would have been enough to sell it all in a single order. The only company that had enough shares to do this in their inventory was Ethereum. They were the only they were the only hedge fund that had that many on hand. And the number of shares that were available to short at that time, um, utilization has been maxed out all of this time. So utilization was completely maxed out as of September 22nd, and it never came back down since. So there's no way that anybody could have gotten a hold of those shares unless they had made a private deal, which is something that can be done. Hedge funds often work together with each other, and they will come to, you know, they will come to agreements behind closed doors when they want to short a company. Um, they'll also do this with market makers, and they will do this with broker banks. But when you have a unique situation like this, where there is a majority shareholder that is trying to accumulate a larger position in a company so that they can potentially sell out the company to a large buyer for profit, their goal is to accumulate vast majority ownership. We're talking greater than 60%. At that time, Ethereum had 61% majority, and they still wanted more. So, what I suspect happened, they knew the dilution was coming, so they took a bunch of their shares out of their inventory and either sold them short or sold them outright. And since that time, the short interest has continued to rise. Now, we're going to talk about something that I'm going to call the game of musical shares. So, here's the $1,000,000 question. How is it that the short interest can continue to rise while utilization is maxed out? The simple answer is somebody can go to a hedge fund that has a significant position in a company and ask them to borrow their shares for short selling. And they can come to a private agreement on what they will pay that company in borrow fees in order to sell those shares short. And that daily fee will be collected according to the price. So, say a company does this. The hedge fund that has lent out their shares still, after they negotiate a price on the fees, they get to negotiate also what the terms are for recalling those shares and all of that good stuff. And we can presume that they're collecting money every single day, uh, which they can use to further play in other positions or accumulate more stock and things like that. So, say that this is what happened with Ethereum. I see that there are a couple of possibilities. Ethereum could have lent out its shares to a large company and done so in anticipation of what was about to happen so that they could use that opportunity to buy up more shares on the market. If that is the case, then they weren't necessarily shorting the company directly, even though they were allowed to do so under the S3 filings that Progenity issued. But they were participating in short selling as a third party by lending their shares out. But what is interesting is, again, that perfect timing of 5 minutes before dilution, 8 million shares suddenly go out onto the market and slam the price down all at once. It's a bit too convenient. I don't really believe in coincidences, especially with the stock market. So I, for that reason, really do think that Ethereum had everything to do with this. So the other possibility, as I mentioned earlier, Ethereum has a bunch of smaller hedge funds that are too small and too spread out to be required to make up SEC filings. They're independent companies. They operate independently. For that reason, they don't have to stick to the same filing requirements that Ethereum Capital Management, the main company, has to report with. So that gives them a lot of flexibility to do some extremely nefarious stuff. So here's where the game of musical shares comes in. Ethereum lends out its own shares to its smaller firms. It lends out those shares to the smaller, we'll call them satellite branches that are then able to short and not have to report their positions against their own stock. They are being lent shares that are out of Ethereum's main inventory. By doing so, all of these little companies are able to trade on the same algorithm so that Ethereum, the mothership, can continue to collect shares, continue to make voting decisions on what Progenity will do in the future and how it will, sell stock or what decisions its board makes and things like that, while at the same time giving the smaller funds the necessary ammunition that they need in order to continue attacking the price. So, looking at how that has obviously backfired, since the price went from $1.20 straight up to $6 at the peak, things have finally come to a bit of a head, haven't they? We were right about a gamma squeeze. There was absolutely a small gamma squeeze that took place in November ahead of the November 19th expiry date. And that much is very clear. What isn't clear is how these shares were covered and how they what isn't clear is how they were able to cover those shares if they were buying to close those positions without moving the price up, because we're talking about a lot of shares. Even from this moment to the next 2 days, that's almost 20. That is 10 million shares, a little over 10 million shares. If Ethereum Capital Management is also able to lend its smaller satellite firms shares out on loans so that they are able to short, then they are also able to lend them out in order to cover them, which is an interesting thing, isn't it? And they could even sell them directly to them through a dark pool trade. That's also very possible. But in the wake of a dilution or in the wake of some negative news, it is entirely possible, in order to meet deadlines for failures to deliver, for a company to borrow shares from somewhere else in order to make good on those failures to deliver. If we look at the security lending volume and the failures to deliver side by side, we'll notice that there is a very clear and obvious ramp, and they are correlated. If we look at the way that the stock has behaved, it went into a bit of a lull with short lending volume as we came into this valley here where the price hit its lowest. and suddenly the short security lending volume, that's these little gray bars, started to form an upward trend. By the time that it had hit its peak is when this FDD spike hit, and we've been on the threshold list ever since we hit this spike. And the security lending volume continues to move in a linear upward trajectory. Just looking at the way that this is, how the peaks of the bars continue to line up in this perfect upward movement, shows that there's an immense amount of games being played. See, what everybody needs to understand about market makers and brokers and hedge funds is that borrowing goes any number of directions, and you can continue lending the same stock over and over and over again. And as this game continues to be played, the FTDs continue to skyrocket, and I anticipate that that's going to continue soon. The thing is that eventually there just isn't enough shares. There just isn't enough. Conveniently, dilution has been able to hit every single time at extremely key moments for this stock. And Ethereum always seems to be in just the right place. However, that's only because they've been in control for so long, and only because retail didn't get wind of things until very recently. Things started to move very much against short sellers ever since retail noticed that Progenity was a short squeeze candidate. These firms that play these games on Wall Street have a very predictable habit of getting extraordinarily greedy and very comfortable with how effective their ways of moving the markets and trading has worked for them in the past. They are creatures of habit. Ethereum has had a habit of shorting companies that it owns in order to accumulate more and more shares. They do this consistently in the stocks that they trade. It allows them to take a majority position, own more and more of the company so that they can sell it out to a large buyer. They've done it before, and they tried to do it here. But since retail got in the way, they've lost their majority position, and now they've had to dilute the stock to such a degree that majority shareholding position is no longer possible for them, and a buyout isn't possible. There's no way to do it, not unless they could get several different firms and pension funds to agree to sell their stock to a major company. And the only way is for I would say Ethereum to make good on their trade now is to cover their positions out of pocket. So here's where the game comes to an end. If Ethereum is an insider and they know exactly what's going to happen before it happens because their founder sits on the board of directors for Progenity, it makes the most sense for him to cover all of his fund's positions before the price gets out of hand. We just saw 10 million shares disappear from the short interest overnight. 2 days is not a lot of time to come up with all those shares. And there's certainly no way that it happened without moving the price, unless those shares were taken out of inventory. And I find it funny that Ethereum filed its 13Ds just before these short interest numbers had to be filed. Their inventory, I suspect, has been significantly depleted so that they could cover those shares because something's about to happen. That's just what I think. Obviously, I'm not a fortune teller. I'm not clairvoyant or seer or anything like that. I don't know exactly what's happening, why it's happening. I'm just speculating based on what I see in the data. But I do know some of the rules of the market. I do know how some of these mechanics work, and part of that is that borrowing shares is such a versatile tool that it allows for incalculable amounts of fraud to take place. And that's why short reports need to be so much more frequent, and why every single company that is short a stock in any major capacity needs to be forced to report daily what their positions are, just like they do with major purchases. Because it's not right that these companies can borrow millions upon millions and millions of shares out of the ether from each other, from themselves, in order to play games with these stocks and use computers to prey on people that have neither the access nor the potential or capacity to trade on the same level as these guys. It'd be like setting up a T-ball toddler up against a major league pitcher. There is just no way. It's morally and ethically reprehensible. But I digress. What I suspect happened is that Ethereum has now accepted the reality that, assuming that they were short, that it's time to get out. And they can't lift the price because they still want to take advantage of whatever time they have left before something happens. But they need to get out in case something does happen. And it can happen any day. So now, I suspect what happened, in order to cover these shares, they took shares out of their own inventory and distributed them to their own hedge funds through either a dark pool transaction or some other trade that would result in no market movement. And that forced that gave them the inventory to cover their shares. That's the simplest explanation for why the price never moved. It's really the only thing that makes sense. And Ethereum, again, is the only hedge fund where that makes sense, where they could do that. Because if Ethereum was distributing shares and lending them out to its own smaller firms for short selling, they would be able to dictate a lower cost to borrow fee. They would be able to lend in basically unlimited number of shares, since they had the 51% majority. And it would guarantee them the ability to recover those shares because they wouldn't be sold, they would simply be lent. And if they're short hedge funds, the smaller funds went belly up in the process, well, that's just like sacrificing a pawn to save the queen. It's no different. Just declare bankruptcy and move on. Since they're independent firms under separate LLC registrations, that's entirely possible. At least the way I see it. If somebody wants to disagree with me, I'd welcome any counter arguments. But as I currently see the way that this is playing out, I see this massive drop in short interest to be an exceedingly bullish thing. And as much as everybody is hoping for a short squeeze, it doesn't take a short squeeze to move a price by 10 times its current amount. That's not what's required. The only thing that's required is for a ton of buying to take place. Just people wanting more of the stock because they like what it's doing and they like what the company is doing and they think that it's worth more than what it's trading at. And I absolutely think that that's what's happening. I think that Progenity is worth a lot more, way more than the $3. Absolutely certain of that. So, those are just my thoughts. You can take it for what it is. As always, none of it's financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm just an amateur that likes to draw lines on a chart. But if any of this makes sense to you, then I don't know. Maybe it'll give you some faith that you don't need to see a short squeeze just to see the price move by 10 times its current price. And that's all I got. And good luck in the markets.